here at AEI. Thank you all for being here in person, and thank you to those of you watching online. And thank you to our staff, in particular Sean Doolin and Caitlin Eversman, for making this event happen. Really appreciate all the hard work and for being here today. We are just hours away from getting a decision. There are nearly $1.8 trillion in student loan debt, and we're soon, tomorrow morning, most likely going to find out whether hundreds of billions of those dollars are going to be forgiven by taxpayers. On the campaign trail, Joe Biden promised to forgive a minimum of $10,000 per borrower, and maybe as a result, on election day, 61% of those with at least a bachelor's degree supported him, which was 4 points better than Hillary Clinton did. 67% of those with a graduate degree supported Biden, while his opponent received 56% support from voters with a high school diploma or less. When he took office, he promptly asked the Democratic majorities in the Senate and the House to act on student loan forgiveness, and they did not. And so instead, he invoked emergency authority under the HEROES Act of 2003, which was a post-9/11 law, which gave authority to the Secretary of Education to, quote, waive or modify any statutory or regulatory provision applicable to the student financial assistance programs under Title IV of the Higher Education Act, as the Secretary deems necessary in connection with a war or other military operation or a national emergency. And of course, in this case, the national emergency was the COVID pandemic. As a result, $10,000 in relief was granted to most students and up to $20,000 for borrowers who had received a Pell Grant. The cost depends on who you ask. The administration's own estimates put it around $300 billion, but other estimates put it much higher, including up to nearly $1 trillion, according to research at UPenn. There were immediate challenges, and honestly, it seemed unlikely that those challenges would prevail. It seemed unlikely they'd even be granted standing to bring the case, much less to decide the case on the merits, but here we are. The Supreme Court will decide on two cases, Biden versus Nebraska and Department of Education versus Brown, first on whether any of the plaintiffs have standing to bring the case among the 6 states and the 2 borrowers, and on the merits, whether the department has exceeded its authority and whether the policy itself was adopted in the appropriate way, given that Congress did not act. Congress has subsequently acted not to forgive loans, but to reject the administration's policy. The Senate recently voted 52-46, including votes from Democrats Joe Manchin and John Tester, along with former Democrat, current independent Kristen Sinema from Arizona. The House likewise voted 208-203, including a couple of Democrats joining Republicans, to reject the Biden administration's loan forgiveness plan. However, that bill was since vetoed by the president and lacked the 2/3 majority necessary to overcome the veto. The implications of this case are wide-reaching, not just in dollars and not just for the loan forgiveness itself. There are many other cases that relate to loans that are still in play today. According to my colleague Nat Malkus, while all of this has been going on, nearly $300 billion has already been spent since the beginning of the pandemic on the loan repayment pause, which is costing about $5 billion per month, changes to borrower defense, changes to public service loan forgiveness, and other policies. Already it looks like the pause will end this fall, but just today the department indicated that despite a congressional agreement, they might try to use executive authority again to shield students from defaulting. Meanwhile, perhaps the biggest policy is IDR, could itself have hundreds of billions of dollars of impact, and that number could go up substantially if loans are not forgiven after the Supreme Court rules. We'll be watching all those policies. We're going to talk with our panel about the implications, and most importantly, whether you agree with this policy or not, the fact is there are 26 million people who are eagerly awaiting this decision because it affects their personal finances. And so we want to talk about the policy, but also the people involved here. Finally, one more plug. We want to not just talk about the policies that we might not like, whether it's loan forgiveness or any others, but also we want to be for a number of policies to not just address the debt issue, but address holistically student loans, higher education, and pathways to good careers, whether that involves college or anything else. And so we've been working with higher education strategy groups. Emmanuel and many others have participated in those groups over the past several months. And we will be releasing some new ideas, and we're going to try to do it in a new and interesting way where people can interact with those policies and choose the policies they think are best for them. So stay tuned on that. For now, I'm going to join the panel, and I'd like to introduce them one by one. So first of all, thank you for joining us here today. I'm going to start down in the end. Russ Ryan is Senior Litigation Counsel at the New Civil Liberties Alliance, a nonpartisan, nonprofit civil rights group that works to protect constitutional freedoms. He has a particular interest in the Securities and Exchange Commission and related issues, and is currently involved in another student loan case in Kansas, which we will be sure to ask him about. He was partner at the law firm King and Spalding for 15 years and taught at the law school at George Mason University right here in the DC area. And we appreciate you being here.
Glad to be here.
Emmanuel Guillory is the Senior Director of Government Relations at the American Council on Education. ACE is often seen as the voice of the nation's colleges and universities, and they represent about 1,700 of them, including 2- and 4-year, both public and private. I've been fortunate to know Emmanuel for a long time, going back to my time at the Department of Ed, and in his time in prior roles at NACU, which represents private colleges and universities, UNCF, and on the Hill, where he worked on the Committee on Education and the Workforce. He was recognized as one of the Hill's top lobbyists in 2020 and 2021. And Emmanuel, we appreciate you being here as well. And last but not least, Lene Erickson is Senior Vice President for Social Policy, Education, and Politics, all of those things, at Third Way, which is a think tank that champions modern center-left ideas. Lene writes extensively on education issues. She is direct, honest, and forceful in her written comments to the Department of Ed, which I can tell you with certainty because I was on the receiving end of a lot of those when I was at the department. And, sometimes we agree, sometimes not, but I think what Lene tries to do, which I really appreciate, is before the kind of bipartisanship that is about doing what's right, not just the little bit of sliver where both parties can agree. So I like that. We need more of that in Washington, and Lene, I appreciate you being here.
That was the nicest intro I think I've ever had. Thank you.
Well, great. Off to a good start. With that, would love to start with you, Lene, and I'm just going to go and ask each of you this question. We had a big case today on higher education. We're expected to have a big case on these two student loan challenges. What is going to happen? What is going to be the implications for student loans, higher ed in general? What do you expect?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I was the one, even in our prep call, that said it was going to happen Friday because I've known this for a long time. I've been a court watcher and a judicial nominees vetter as my first job ever in DC, so very familiar with the court, and they like to run away after something that's about to cause protests. So I was like, they're going to do it right before the weekend and get out of town. So I do think it will, be tomorrow morning, and kind of thought it would be the whole time. And I think of tomorrow morning's decision really as kind of the season finale of the first season of this drama and not the series finale. I think we're going to see a lot more to come, both on the Hill and from the department, no matter how the court rules. My guess as a person that went to law school a long time but hasn't done real law in a very long time too, is that they're going to strike it down. I think they, if they weren't going to strike it down, they would have done it earlier because then they wouldn't have wanted to run out of town. So, I think that's what we're about to see. And so for the left that has made this really their cause célèbre, their number one ask of the Biden administration, they're not going to be satisfied with this. They're going to go back and say, do it again. Do it under a different authority. Go back, cancel it under settlement and compromise, which is the other legal authority that folks had talked about for a long time, and then were kind of surprised was switched out at the end in the way that the administration tried to go. They've already said as much, they've sent as much to their email lists, everybody knows that's gonna happen. If for some reason the cancellation does stand, there's a lot of other lawsuits in the works that can leave to others to talk about that, so it won't be to the end of the story either. But you referenced all the things that need to happen now on student loans, and it's really the borrowers that are going to be in a pickle now, because I had someone at my office say to me the other day, I paid down a bunch of my loans during the payment pause, but then I went back and got that money back out, and now it's sitting in a savings account. Do you think I should spend it? And I was like, no, don't spend it. But that person works at a think tank in Washington, D.C. I don't think that most people had the foresight or were educated on the fact that that was really what they were going to have to do. They were going to have to pay those loans back again. And I really worry about what's going to happen to borrowers who thought their balance was going to be down $10,000 or $20,000, and now it's like, just kidding. That's not the way we should be making policy. It's very damaging to people, and it's worrisome because then add on to that, obviously we're going to ask people to start paying down their student loan payments again or for the first time for many people who've never paid down loans because they've been just out of school in the last 3 years. We don't know where they live. Their servicers don't have enough staff. We're not properly funding the FSA to find them and tell them where to pay their loans. So I just think we're headed for disaster if we don't get ahead of this and really say, we need to clearly communicate to borrowers what is going to come, what is required of them. And we just frankly haven't done that yet. And if we're going to try to put starting the payments plus a new income-based repayment plan plus you thought you had these loans forgiven, but now you didn't. That's a lot of change all at once. And I think those of us who think about this in DC really need to get ahead of it and help people kind of sort through, how do I make sense of all that and not end up in a place where I have no idea where even to send my check to pay my student loan?
Emmanuel, what do you think?
Well, to build off, how do you follow that? But I think I would agree with my colleague in a sense that I believe that the Supreme Court will not allow this to go through. And I think that this has been a fear that we've had from the very beginning. And it goes back to when Senator Warren was championing the fact that we need to forgive $50,000 in student loan debt, and Chuck Schumer got involved, and they had Harvard put out a report about why, and using the authority in the HEA to be the basis at that particular point in time. And then there was that political push that the Biden administration had. But because of that political push, we felt and pretty much saw the Biden administration go back and forth with, we don't know if we can do 50,000 for everybody. We kind of need to target it a little bit more. But there was that push internally within the caucus to, no, we need to go as far reaching as we possibly can. And so the proposal that they came out with, to be honest, we were happy that it wasn't, a blanket all forgiveness for everyone, that they tried to at least target it a little bit and put some sort of rationale to it. But obviously using the HEROES Act of 2003, which, by the way, that bill, when it was first passed in August of 2003, was a Republican. It was led by a Republican, John Klein to be exact, and it was bipartisan. And then when it was extended in 2005, it was again led by John Klein, and it was bipartisan. However, in 2009, I believe, 2 years after, when that bill was put forth by the Democrats, that was not at all bipartisan, even though George Bush happened to approve the bill. But that was during a time when Democrats had the majority in the House and the Senate. And so when we even think about HEROES 2003, why that's even a thing, September 11th happened in 2001. Congress was trying to figure out, what do we do and how do we do it and how do we best serve Americans? And so that was a way to give the secretary authority and flexibility to just act quickly, because when that attack happened, there was really not a clear process in place for the secretary to be able to move swiftly in a way as such. But now there's obviously been back and forth arguments about, well, do we really believe Section 2 of the HEROES Act 2003 really gives the secretary the ability to forgive the loans? Now, let's think back to the Trump administration. So obviously, CARES happened March 2020, and then suspension of student loan payments happened, right? But in 2021, Betsy DeVos had resigned. And after that, there was a memorandum that came out basically saying that the administration does not have the authority to do this. They cited the Constitution, Article 1, as an example, and also kind of tried to, in some ways stick it to the incoming administration. But at the same time, when the Biden administration came in, they of course rescinded that and said, while we agree that the analysis of the HEROES Act is correct, we don't agree with the interpretation. And so here we have what we always feared, a situation where our biggest concern, as Lene mentioned, are the students. The students are being jerked around, back and forth. Hey, you're gonna have to start repaying. This is the official cutoff date. Oh no, we're gonna extend it a little bit longer. If we recall back in 2022, apparently December 31st, 2022 was gonna be the final date, apparently. And I think they actually went ahead and notified borrowers in 2022, beginning like late summer, early fall, that, hey, we got to ramp up, repayments are about to start back, and then it was extended once again. And so, as Lene predicted, I do believe that tomorrow will be the date that we find out that it's not going to move forward. And then what does that mean for, those little more than 25 million borrowers who have submitted their applications, those 16 million borrowers who have been approved, and how then do they begin to prepare to repay? But as Michael mentioned in the beginning statements, just this morning we are learning that the department actually is wanting to build in a 3-month grace period to this new plan that I think they want to dub the SAVE plan, which before there wasn't really a name for it. They were just amending the revising the repay plan that we have now. And so I think that also stems, though, from the remarks made in the oral argument. So for those of you that actually listened to the oral arguments in February, the general arguing on behalf of the Biden administration actually articulated the fact that, she believes that there's going to be a lot of delinquencies, if there's no grace or nothing given to these students when they have to start repaying their loans.
And so we could be in a situation where yet again there's an indefinite series of extensions, not on the need to pay because interest is going to keep accruing, but on
interest starts back September 1st and it's going to keep.
So let me go ahead to Russ. I'd love to hear your take as somebody who's watching these loan cases in general. You're involved in some of them yourself. You've watched the court a long time. What is going to happen tomorrow from your perspective?
I tend to agree with Lene and Emmanuel that if the court reaches the merits of the case, they will strike it down. I think there's at least a majority of the justices who don't believe this is a lawful exercise under the HEROES Act. However, they first have to find that at least one of these litigants has standing. And that, I think, is a closer question, because if nobody has standing, that goes to the court's jurisdiction, and the court cannot address the merits if it does not find that it has jurisdiction. So I see sort of 3 potential outcomes. One is they find no standing, and then they do not address the merits of the policy, and it presumably goes forward unless and until someone with standing comes in to challenge it again. And we can get to that later because we think we have someone in the wings on that. But even if there's a decision of no standing, I do think you may see some concurring opinions or dissenting opinions that do address the merits, but they wouldn't be precedential. They'd just be sort of venting and hoping that lower courts will take the cues if this starts percolating up through the courts again. The second is they could find standing and declare it unlawful. And then, as Lene and Emmanuel said, I don't think that's necessarily the end of it. This administration has pretty much shown that it doesn't always take no for an answer from the courts. We've seen it before with the rent moratorium issue that seemed to come back a second or third time. And the third chance is they find standing, but a majority of the court says, close question, but we think it's within the Secretary of Education's discretion to do what he did in this situation. And again, that I think would be sort of a huge win for the administration, and I'm not sure there are many more avenues to fight it at that point if the court sort of definitively holds this is a lawful interpretation of the statute. I think that third scenario is pretty unlikely. So that's sort of where I come out with it. But just to follow up on something Emmanuel said, I think there were at least 2 occasions where the payment pause was declared last and final. And then as the date approached, oh, never mind, we're going to extend it again. So it's been extended something like 8 times, I think now. And there's litigation over that as well. There's a lot that still needs to be figured out here, no matter what happens tomorrow. But I think whatever happens tomorrow, it's going to move the ball in one direction or another substantially, but probably not end this.
Russ, I want to stay with you for a minute. Let's just zoom out for a minute. I didn't go to law school, but I did graduate from 4th grade. And in 4th grade, I learned that there are 3 branches of government: separation of powers, checks and balances. And just from that perspective, it seems like you have this situation where Congress put this law in place, questionable interpretation of what they really meant the department's powers were. The department went ahead and acted. Congress has since essentially rebuked them and said, we want this pause to stop, and yet the president can just veto them, and a simple majority in both houses is not enough. And the third branch of government, the courts, may, as you said, not be able to decide the merits of the case at all because of this standing question. And so just those of us who are a little confused here, help us out. How does something like that happen where it's essentially one branch of government acting, and it seems pretty clear the other 2 branches of government don't like it, and they may not be able to do anything about it?
Well, I have this memory that at one point, even when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker, I think Biden was already president, and she basically turned to him and said, you can't do this.
Well, he
you
wasn't
need
in the
us to do
room
it.
when that happened, to be clear. She turned to the press and said he doesn't have the authority.
But so it's not, I kind of view it as a bipartisan understanding that if we're really being honest, this is something Congress should be doing. It should not be, if anyone does it. And I really have no official position on that. But if it's going to be done, it should be done by our elected representatives. And one of the reasons why it's so hard to find someone with standing on something like this is that exactly 100 years ago this month, the Supreme Court said that in general, taxpayers, no matter how much they're upset about the way their money is being spent, have no standing to challenge government action. It's a case called Frothingham against Mellon. And just by coincidence, it was decided in June 1923. And it's stood ever since pretty much. And I think if taxpayers were allowed to sue over these things, sure, you'd have a lot more litigation, but you'd have no shortage of people with legitimate standing because, this is so much money that the average taxpayer is going to be hit up for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And to me, that ought to be enough of an injury to get you in court to plead your case. But we don't have that, and so in this situation, I think, people who want to get things done through administrative action are pretty clever, and they came up with what I think they believe is the perfect crime.
So I was going to mention this.
$500 billion heist from the public fisc, and nobody can stop it.
Can they get away with it? That's the
Yeah,
question. We'll
so-
find out tomorrow. Real quick, because I want to get to Emmanuel and Lene, but this question of taxation, could a future Republican president look at the tax code and say, okay, my voters are about here, I'm just not going to audit people who do this, or I'm not going to look at this section of the tax code, or I'm not going to enforce these rules to the benefit of mostly my voters? Could they do something like that?
I haven't thought through that one. The one I would think is more likely is Republican gets in there and says, we really, really need to spend more money to shut the border. And Congress says, sorry, we ain't got none, and we're not giving it to you. And he says, well, I'll find some statute that gives me wide discretion, and I'll just write an executive order that says spend the money here.
Well, and in fact, that is what the Trump administration
I
did.
think they tried it.
Yeah, and which is why some have, thought that this is not a good precedent to be setting in general. If a first Trump administration decided they wanted to use this kind of authority to build their border wall, I have no idea what a second, more creative Trump administration would come up with to do with this kind of authority. But I can tell you it's going to be a heck of a lot more creative than that.
Well, we will definitely leave those conversations for another day. I want to go back to Emmanuel, though. Getting back to this picture of, even if these loans are forgiven, it doesn't necessarily solve the fact that people are taking out new loans every year. We haven't changed the nature of the loan programs, and the institutions, are involved in that as well. They are often clamoring for more tools to be able to limit borrowing and make sure that college is more affordable. But from the institutional perspective, what is their responsibility, and what are some of the tools that they would like to have and don't have today to make college more affordable?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, first and foremost, in talking with our member presidents about this particular issue, a lot of them, of course, they want what's best for their students. And in their opinion, these are students that have already graduated, and so they're living their lives, pursuing their careers, and at that point, the institution doesn't really have a whole lot of control over what's happening. Choices that are being made, situations that are, happening in their former students' lives. But when it comes to accountability, there are proposals out there that obviously want to hold more institutions accountable. And from conversations I've had with our presidents, they don't mind being held accountable per se. But if it does come down to something such as risk sharing, which is something that we've been hearing about and seeing, and there's proposals out there regarding that, then Mike, you mentioned the ability to limit borrowing if that is the case. Right now, institutions don't have that ability. Students are able to borrow as much as they need to. In the PLUS loan program, it's just unlimited borrowing up to cost of attendance. And so sometimes there are concerns about what students are borrowing for, but that does not mean that presidents don't understand the fact that there are students from low wealth families who are going to have to borrow more money because they don't have any other resources to pull from, and they have to be able to eat and to live and to get to school and get back home and those sorts of things. But at the same time, I would want to say that our institutions are very sensitive to the fact that there's $1.6 trillion in federal student loan debt still out there with about 43 million borrowers, right? And that there is a huge need, and they want to be a part of the conversation of making college more affordable, which is why they have come together, and they are very supportive of doubling the Pell Grant. So I have to throw that in there because they ask about that a lot. It's something that they really believe could be a great solution, or at least, investing in that program, which we have seen that investment happen from Congress. It's increased $900 for the past 2 fiscal years. Changes to the FAFSA Simplification Act of 2020 is going to help around 1.7 million more borrowers access the maximum Pell. It's going to give access to around 600,000 more borrowers, according to Secretary Cardona and what he's been articulating in hearings as of late. So I think the conversation continues.
Great. Staying on that issue of addressing other aspects of the loan program, Lene, you've said that if we focus on loan forgiveness and don't focus on fixing the overall system, we're going to miss an opportunity. And if we do, shame on us. I think those are your words exactly. Have we missed our shot here? And if so, what do we do about that? If not, what are some reasonable, in this world, realistic reforms that we should look at instead?
We absolutely haven't missed our shot because there are still people enrolling in college and starting right now for the next academic year and taking out loans right now, and we need to fix it. One of my major concerns about the idea of wiping away past student borrowing is that it does absolutely nothing to fix the problems moving forward and spends a heck of a lot of money doing so. And so, when you think about, for example, that half of this outstanding student loan balance is from graduate programs, where, as Emmanuel said, there's essentially unlimited borrowing. That's a problem because if borrowing is unlimited, then schools have no reason to not, double, triple tuition. They can make up whatever number they want because we've created a policy that says you can literally make up whatever number you want, and then students can borrow to fix it. And I think that is even more disconcerting when you look at this new, income-based repayment plan, which I think is really important and also creates a potential moral hazard, because what we're doing is saying, okay, you actually don't ever have to pay back your student loans again. We will not ever let your balance grow, no matter how much you're paying into this, even if it's less than what your interest would be, which again incentivizes institutions to say, okay, great, I'll make it more expensive. There's no reason not to. So I think what we really think a lot about is how do we change that incentive? We can't continue to send blank checks out and not really even know what the outcomes are that we're getting. We can't continue to pay folks that are attending higher education programs, pay those programs without knowing anything about what the outcomes are and whether they're delivering a real return on investment to students and taxpayers. And we can't continue to have people taking out unlimited loans for a program that they think is going to be good because you know what? It's accredited, it's allowed to access Title IV aid. That's a stamp of approval that we're putting on that program. And then it turns out a lot of those programs are leaving people not better off than when they enrolled. They're leaving people below the poverty line. They're leaving people making less than they would have if they just would have gotten a job with their high school degree. And they're leaving people not able to complete, but also have the loans. And those are the folks that are defaulting. People who weren't able to complete their degree, but they have the loan still. But they don't get the earnings premium from having the degree to be able to pay for it. So I think we really need to look across the board. And the thing that actually makes me excited, and I don't often have a lot of optimistic news in DC nowadays, but even in the past, week and a half, we've seen bipartisan attention to this problem in a way that I think is super, super important. So about 10 days ago, Senator Cassidy, who is, a huge leader on these issues, on the Republican side, put out a package of bills that would limit graduate borrowing, that would also say if you are an undergraduate program, any program, you have to show that most of the folks that enrolled in your program 6 and 10 years later are making more than the average high school graduate. That seems like very basic measure of return on investment to me. Are you better off or worse off than you would have been if you had never enrolled? And then he even went further than the Democrats have and said, and for graduate programs, that should be better off than a BA. If you are not making more money than the average BA holder, don't go to that school. And I think there's a lot of nuances to it, but that's a really interesting thing to think about moving forward. And it really ties in very similarly to what the administration has done on the gainful employment programs, where they said, same idea, earnings premium. Are you making more than a high school graduate? If not, don't have the taxpayers pay for this program. And then they went further and said, and we're gonna look at that data for every single program. Not just for for-profit programs or career programs, but all of them. So it feels like we're moving in a direction where we actually want to look at the outcomes in higher ed. There's a lot to still figure out about how to do that in a way that supports institutions that are doing the yeoman's work of economic mobility. But at least we're talking about it, and I think 4 or 5 years ago we just weren't.
Well, I love the optimism. I share it, and probably depends on the details to actually get it over the finish line. But you started by saying that you think we're going to have more seasons of this, that this is not going to be the end of the exciting courtroom drama on student loans. So you alluded to the idea that there's maybe a plan B from the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Okay, this didn't work. This got struck down by the courts, if that's in fact what happens. What is that plan B? Tell us a little bit more about what that might look like.
Well, I think the first plan B is going to be protesting in front of the Supreme Court, which is why they wanted to do it on the weekend. And then the second plan B is going to be putting those signs on the lampposts all around the White House that say #cancel student debt, which if you've been in DC for longer than 9 months, you saw ubiquitously all around the White House. So there's going to be a lot of grassroots pressure, I'm sure. And then what the pressure is going to be asking the administration to do is to say, okay, do it again, but do it instead of using this HEROES Act that is probably not going to be upheld. Do it under the HEA authority, the Higher Education Act authority, that says the Department of Education has the ability to compromise and settle different kinds of student loans, because this money is owed to the department. So essentially the department can say, you don't owe it to me anymore. But I think that's going to start this whole clock over again. And this, the poor people that are sitting around wondering, do I have that $20,000 or not? That creates a whole new set of jerking around that we're going to have to worry about, especially if you're making payments. Should you be making the payments or not? Are your loans gone or are they not gone? It's all very confusing and unprecedented. But also what I worry about is that's the same authority that the administration has used to do a lot of other things, including canceling loans for borrowers who have been defrauded by predatory institutions, which I very much support. That's the same authority. Same authority they're using to do these income-based repayment programs. Well, if you ask the Supreme Court, oh, hey, does this apply? And then the answer is no, the answer might be no for a lot of those other things too, and question whether they're standing for people to challenge it. But it just worries me because there are things that the department should use that authority for. And if you take it to this extreme, then it may be struck down altogether and then you don't get to use it.
Well, and there are questions in this case, not just on these loan programs, but there are a lot of other areas where this department and this administration are maybe stretching their authority a little bit beyond what power Congress has given them, and this Supreme Court has shown a willingness to curb that a bit. Emmanuel, I want to ask you, this is not a loan policy, and ACE has been fairly neutral on the loan issues, but you have been very outspoken on another area where the department is perhaps stretching its authority, which is on the third-party servicers' guidance and potential regulation that might come out. For those who don't know, this could potentially involve the Department of Education regulating the entirety of the education technology sector. It has a lot of people worried, including the public institutions that rely on them and many, many others who are providing any number of services to colleges and universities. Tell us a little bit about what that might mean if the court comes down, to your point, Lene, and says, okay, you don't have this authority, you don't have this authority. Could there be challenges to some of these other policies as well?
Well, my response to that would be yes. I think absolutely. We, as we articulated to the department, were very, very concerned about the expansion of the third-party servicer definition, which is completely not in line, in our opinion, with the Higher Education Act, with the intent of Congress, and would have caused a number of issues, which we're happy that they put a halt on that. But even when you think about the manner in which they went about trying to move forward with that, it was through sub-regulatory guidance. And earlier in the spring, they actually put out in their unified agenda that they were going to look at third-party servicer issues. So now you have a dear colleague and other sub-regulatory guidance, a blog, I believe, too, as well, talking about these issues and what institutions have to do to abide and to comply. And remember, these institutions are made up of individuals who have good intentions. They're there to help students. They're there to provide a service that's a quality academic program and the makeup of that. But these individuals also want to make sure they're abiding by the law. And so if the Supreme Court does rule and say, hey, this will not stand, then I think that gives a little bit more weight to the fact that, well, with the third party service issue or other issues like that may come down the pike, we can look to this and point to this and use this as an example of why they should, in a lot of ways, in the best way possible to say it, but stay within their lane that Congress gave them. And in speaking to the department, like, there are great people that work there, credible people that work there, very smart people that work there, right? And they're trying to do what they believe is right, which every administration that comes in, they put forward policies that they believe is right. And so we can't fault them in that, but however, when it comes down to figuring out clever ways to give themselves the authority, well, that should never really be the case. Congress is the branch that has that authority to determine these types of things. And to build onto something that Lene said earlier really quickly about just student loan repayment in general, there's too many repayment plans out there. There's just too many repayment plans. And Lene talked about on the Senate side, but I want to quickly highlight the FAIR Act that on the House side just was introduced with Dr. Fox, and rolling back all of those repayment plans, simplifying those back to 2, which we have heard before, but being a little bit more generous to borrowers than what we've seen before in the past too. I think that just shows that Congress is really thinking about ways to simplify this process so borrowers can better understand what it is they're getting into and what it is they have to comply with. And the same should be for the department with institutions. Complying, it should be easier to understand and to digest. And when you have all of these random things happening, coming and going, then you just kind of create chaos.
So we've been asking these questions with the assumption that the court will side with the states and with the borrowers who sued the department, but it's possible they won't. We have no idea. And so, Russ, I want to ask you just one final question, then we'll go to some audience questions and some questions from folks who are watching online. But you're involved in another case that's on hold right now because of these cases before the Supreme Court. Tell us what happens if the court rules in favor of the department. Are the loans forgiven? Are there other cases that are going to put that back on ice? Tell us.
I think if the court rules on the merits in favor of the department, that puts challengers and objectors to this whole program in a tight spot. I'm not sure there's a plan B at that point. Give us some time, we might think of one. If all they do is throw it out on standing, well then our case presents a different standing theory. And we argued it in an amicus brief in the cases that are before the court now. And we think it's an alternative standing theory. It's probably not the right time and place to get into the nitty-gritty on the standing, but there's something called the public service loan forgiveness. I think it might have been mentioned earlier. And nonprofits and state governments, nonprofits like AEI, I guess, benefit from that because if you have outstanding student loan debt and you work for a nonprofit or a state government for 10 years and make your payments throughout the 10 years, you get your entire remaining balance discharged after the 10 years. So the theory of standing is that Congress deliberately gave that competitive advantage to governments and nonprofits when they're seeking to hire and retain college graduates. And now comes the Department of Education and says, oh, it doesn't matter who you work for. We're gonna wipe out your debt, whether you work for a nonprofit or government, or you work for a for-profit corporation. And I think that puts the nonprofit employers and state employers, it removes an advantage that Congress gave them in the marketplace. I think that's a sufficient injury to constitute standing. So we think our case would survive and then go forward if all the court did was throw the case out on standing. But we'll see.
We'll see what happens tomorrow morning. With that, we have time for just a few questions. There are microphones that are going around back there, so please raise your hand if you have a question in the room, and folks will come around with microphones. When you do, just cite your name and your affiliation and let us know your question. Yep, back here.
Hi, Mark. Can you hear me? Okay, Mark Goldwine, Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. When do you all expect the administration to release their final income-driven repayment rule and implement that? And do you expect a court challenge?
Linnea, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, well, I never trust it's coming real soon, because it seems like that's happened a lot throughout the administrations in some respects because of COVID and other things. But what I've heard is it's coming real soon. So we'll see. And I think it creates enormous pressure to actually get the rule in place, as soon as humanly possible. If they're going to start repayments, they need to tell people what plan they're allowed to be in, and they can't, have people start finding out their servicer and then getting into a new payment plan and whatever. So I think we're hopeful that it will, be in place and ready by the fall, by the time people have to start paying their checks again. And I'll say politically, they better do that, because even if they do another round of litigation over, using some other authority to cancel student debt, a lot of people still have student debt they need to pay, and they're not going to have it canceled right away because there will be ongoing litigation. And so they need to have something to give to folks. So I think they're trying to get it done very, very quickly. But there's only so many people in the department, and there's a lot of other things to do. So I'm hopeful it comes out by the fall. I think that there probably will be litigation, but at least from what I've heard from some of the smart folks who spend more time in a courtroom than I do, there might be a tougher standing case there, because I'm not sure who has the injury to say that they can challenge that case. That being said, I mean, the reason that it was so clear that it was going to be very, very hard to defend in court was because of the Supreme Court's decision last year in the EPA case, where the court said you can't do this giant thing on climate change through this regulation, because that's not what Congress meant. And the standing was super, super fuzzy there, but they said, well, this is a major question. This is something that has a lot of political or economic significance. And so we're going to be a little bit more flexy with standing, because we think that we shouldn't just let government do things that have huge significance and nobody's allowed to challenge it in court. And so if this isn't a major question, I don't know what is. And it's possible that, an income-based repayment plan that very frankly is even more money than we're talking about here, as Mark well knows, I'm citing his research there, is also a major question. So as a longtime court watcher, I find that people are very strict on standing when they don't like the merits of a case, and they're very open to somebody having standing if they do. So it's very possible it will certainly be challenged in court. Whether it gets this high, I don't know. But I think it's also going to be challenged in Congress. There's a lot of folks that are worried about how expensive it is, and it's going to be the next target. And there are Democrats that are worried about how expensive it is too. And I think if they had just done that Congressional Review Act vote, where a handful of Democrats sided with Republicans, they'd done it just on cancellation and not going back on all of the payment pause stuff, you would have seen a much higher number of Democrats side with Republicans, because there's a lot of folks that don't love the cancellation piece or don't think that the department has the authority to do it. And they were very worried because it actually meant you were going to go back and add balances to people's loans, and that seemed unfair. And so a lot of folks voted against it. But I think you would have ended up with a higher number of Dems. And so it's possible we could see even bipartisan movement, as you said, in Congress to say, this is our job to figure this out. So let us figure it out.
Well, yeah, and it gets to something Emmanuel was alluding to earlier, that if you're having to kind of squint at a 20-year-old law and suddenly you find something that gives you the authority to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, the court has kind of said in the EPA case and some of the other recent cases that maybe that's not going to be acceptable. And so we'll see how broad the ruling is tomorrow, if they do in fact rule against the department on some of those questions. Russ, just briefly, I'm wondering if you have an opinion on standing. It's been tough on this case. There were a lot of people sitting in this room. I remember at different events in the fall and last summer saying, oh, there's no way that these cases are going to proceed. And here we are at the Supreme Court. Do you think there is a chance of someone having standing on a challenge to the IDR plan?
Yeah, I think it's going to be at least as challenging. I really haven't studied the IDR in a way that got my wheels spinning about who might have standing, but just the little I know about it, I suspect it'll be a similar challenge. But if there's someone out there, we'll find them.
Moving on to a question from people watching online. Do you think the Biden administration will cooperate with the bipartisan effort in Congress to reform the student loan system? Anybody want to take that?
Well, I guess I'll try to chime in here. Do I think they will cooperate? It depends on what chamber they're working with, maybe. I would say the House side, probably not so much, just because of the political ideologies and the differences there, not because of the inability to work together. But on the Senate side, they're forced to be a little bit more bipartisan on the issues. So I think that if there's going to be successful collaboration between the department and a chamber of Congress, it would more than likely be the Senate side. But as we have seen in various proposals, and one that I had mentioned earlier, there's ideas and thoughts that members have about repayment and about simplifying that. This is nothing new. We've been seeing this for years. But the department yet is still moving in a direction that is not simplification. And back in the negotiated rulemaking sessions, when they even put forward this revised repay plan, and I think at that time they were calling it the extended income contingent repayment plan is the name they had used in the negotiated rulemaking session. A number of negotiators were upset in saying, why are we creating yet another plan for borrowers in addition to all the other plans that we have? This is already too much. Why don't we simplify? I mean, it was across the board for the most part. We were all saying simplify, simplify, and that's not what we've gotten. What we got instead was, okay, we won't create a new plan, but we will just revise the current repay plan and make it different. But now we're hearing it's going to be called the SAVE plan. So is that going to be new, or what are we actually doing there? But I wanted to talk about that really quickly because I believe there's a lot of political pressure with the income-driven repayment plan to move forward, because in August of last year, when the White House put out the announcement about this whole $10,000, $20,000 student loan debt forgiveness, they also, revealed details about this income-driven repayment plan, which were different than what we actually saw in the negotiated rulemaking session. So for the first time, a lot of us that sat around that table were reading about this plan with new things that we didn't even know the department was even considering. So since that conversation's been happening since August for the department, I think that there's political pressure for them to definitely get this thing through the door by November 1, so it can be in effect by next July. And it'll be interesting having them do that, plus try to fulfill their robust regulatory agenda that they put out earlier this year.
I will just say, though, the reason that everyone can agree on simplify and then it never happens is that if you're in the department, just to give them, credit for a second on this, or any department for that matter, if you are going to change the plans, you can't make everybody go into a new plan that hurts anyone. Right? You can't say, oh, I'm going to change your contract and put you into a plan that's less good for you personally, financially. And there are so many different permutations of people and how much they're making and how much loans they have and how long they have to pay off and whether they're, eligible for PSLF, all these things. And so you can't just be like, okay, actually, let's start over, because you have all these loan contracts that are out there. So yes, we'd all love to just start over. We can't do that. I think everybody's trying, and there is a lot of there is a lot of movement to just try to say, okay, well, what they were thinking is, well, if we make this one as generous as we are, maybe this one will be okay for everyone because it's just that generous, which is possible. I don't know, but I think that's a little bit more complicated. I will say on the bipartisan front, though, we're going to have to see bipartisan action around these issues very soon, and that is around funding FSA. We need to, if we're going to actually get the student loan payments starting again, we're going to start this giant machine again. We have to staff it. And servicers have laid people off. They don't have people to take the calls. Servicers don't know where their borrowers live because people have moved over the last 3 years. New people have graduated that have never even made a payment. There's so many problems, and there's not enough people to staff it. And I'm not an expert on this, but the folks we work with at New America they think that basically we pretty much need to double FSA's appropriations to make the payment restart happen in any way that's not a complete disaster. And I'm not sure if you have been following, but there was a debt ceiling, there were some limits on what we can spend, and now there's even a bigger fight about maybe we want those limits to be even lower. And so there's not a lot of money laying around. But I think it is incumbent on all of these members to get together and figure out where are we gonna pilfer from to make this happen. Because if we just lead into, everybody's gotta pay their student loans again, but we don't prepare the machine to make that happen, we can see the student loan machine collapse. And that's not good for borrowers, that's not good for taxpayers, it's not good for anybody. One of the very most cynical Republicans I talked to about this said, well, maybe they're just gonna try to make the loan machine collapse, and then they'll say, well, I guess you don't have to pay your student loans because there's no servicers to collect them. I don't think that's the best way forward. So I think we got to figure out, how do we make this work again? How do we make it work in the future for borrowers? And that is going to absolutely take both Democrats and Republicans.
And you wonder why it's so hard for students to figure any of this out. You just read the mind of somebody who asked that exact question about FSA from somebody watching online. So thank you. We'll cross that one off the list. We have just under a minute left. If there's anybody in the room who has a very quick question, we can go right here. Just wait for the microphone if you could.
Thank you. You brought up the debt ceiling just now. I'm curious to know, if there had been no debt ceiling deal struck between the president and the speaker, do you think, and the president had used executive action to raise the debt ceiling unilaterally, do you think the Supreme Court would have struck that down, or do you think they would have recognized the economic consequences that would have come with the default?
I think even the president's lawyers said that they would strike that down, which is why they had to do something that they really didn't want to do and agree to these funding limits. They're literally, the president's lawyers said you cannot do that. So at least there are some limits to what folks in the administration think that their powers are here, and that's, they swallowed something they really didn't like for it. I will say the you can't kick the payment pause out again part was a surprise to people in that deal. And I think it actually gave the administration cover, because now they can't kick it out again. And they were going to be asked to kick it out again, especially if the court rules against them tomorrow. So I think they were like, okay, see, now we can't. And now they're trying to figure out this, making sure that people don't default. But it was interesting because nobody knew that was going to happen. And then all of a sudden everyone's like, wait, what's in there? Oh, we're starting loan payments again. Cool. So now we got to fund the starting the loan payments again.
But one quick thing I'll add about starting the loan payments is that the secretary did say in hearings that they were definitely ending it. And so that came before the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So I think that it was easier for that to be a bipartisan agreement because the department already put it out there. So it's just, able to move forward in that way.
For the third time. It's third time final.
Yeah.
Tomorrow morning, hopefully we will have an answer to all of these questions and many more, but there might be a lot more drama to come on this and many other issues. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thanks so much for coming, everybody.
Stay tuned for season 2.